The first time I saw my wife's signature on the deed, I did not feel angry. I felt the kind of quiet a man feels when he realizes the person standing beside him has been measuring the value of his life in acres, dollars, and exit routes. My name is Jack Miller, 42 years old, born and raised in western Kentucky, and that land was never just dirt to me. It was 48 acres of rolling pasture outside Bowling Green, a gravel drive half a mile long, a red barn that leaned a little more every winter, and an old white farmhouse my grandfather built with his own hands before air conditioning was common and before men like him trusted banks with anything more than a handshake. I had walked that fence line since I was 8 years old. I had learned to drive there in a beat-up Ford pickup with my father's hand hovering near the wheel. I had buried 2 dogs under the big oak near the south pond. I had watched my mother hang sheets on the clothesline while summer heat shimmered over the hayfield like glass. That land had seen every version of me before the world got complicated. A skinny boy with muddy boots. A young man with more pride than money. A husband who thought love meant sharing everything. That last one was the version Sarah counted on. She knew the weak place. She knew I did not think in terms of claims and leverage and clauses printed in 12-point font. I thought in terms of loyalty. Family. Promises made at kitchen tables after the coffee had gone cold. Maybe that was my mistake. Or maybe the real mistake was hers, because she forgot one thing about men raised around land. We may be slow to speak, slow to accuse, slow to believe the worst, but we remember boundaries. Every post, every gate, every inch. The morning it happened, the air smelled like cut grass and rain moving in from the west. I was at Miller Construction, standing in the yard behind the office, checking lumber invoices with a pencil behind my ear and sawdust on my boots, when my phone rang. The caller ID said Warren County Clerk's Office. I almost let it go to voicemail. County calls usually meant permits, zoning, some missing form with a stamp in the wrong corner. I answered with one hand still flipping through receipts. The woman on the other end sounded careful, the way people sound when they are about to hand you bad news wrapped in polite language. She asked me to confirm my name, then my address, then whether I was aware of a warranty deed transfer recorded that morning involving the Miller family property off Clay Ridge Road. For a second, I thought I had misheard her. The yard noise faded. A compressor kicked on somewhere behind me, loud and then distant, like it belonged to another world. I asked her to repeat it. She did. The words came slower this time, each one landing with weight. Transfer recorded. Buyer listed. Sale price entered. Spousal authorization attached. My mouth went dry. I remember staring at a stack of 2x4s, trying to make the sentence fit inside my life. Land like that does not vanish. It does not sneak out the back door. It does not get sold while a man is drinking gas station coffee and checking receipts. But there it was, entered into the county system like a weather report. Clean. Official. Final. I asked whose name was on the authorization. The woman hesitated just long enough for my chest to tighten. Then she said it. Sarah Miller. My wife. 13 years of marriage. And her name suddenly sounded like a door closing. I did not yell. I did not throw the phone. I did not demand answers from a clerk who was only reading what the screen told her. I thanked her, because manners are strange things. They survive even when the floor drops out beneath you. Then I walked into my office, shut the door, and sat behind my desk with my boots planted flat on the floor like the room might tip sideways. On the wall across from me hung a framed photograph of my grandfather standing beside the barn in 1964, hat tilted low, hands on his hips, looking at the camera like a man who knew exactly what belonged to him and why. I looked at that picture for a long time. The old man had survived drought, debt, bad crops, and worse weather. I wondered what he would think of me right then, sitting there in a clean office with central air, blinds half drawn, finding out from a stranger that my own wife had tried to sell the one thing he told my father never to gamble with. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Sarah. Just a text. Dinner at 7. Don't be late. I stared at those 4 words until they stopped looking like language. Dinner at 7. Like nothing had happened. Like the ground under our marriage had not cracked open before lunch. Like she had not placed a price tag on my family's history and signed her name with a steady hand. I set the phone face down and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was a blue folder I had not touched in years, the kind of folder a man keeps because his father tells him to, even when he does not understand why. The paper inside smelled faintly of dust and old ink. Across the top were the words Miller Family Irrevocable Land Trust. My father's signature was there. Mine was there. My grandfather's name appeared in the language like a ghost guarding a gate. I read the first page slowly, then the second, then the clause I had forgotten existed. And by the time the rain finally started ticking against my office window, I was no longer confused. I was calm, because Sarah had sold my land. But she had not read the one document that mattered. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, letting the hum of the air conditioner fill the space around me while the rain pattered lightly against the office window. The sky had turned a muted gray, the clouds hanging low and heavy over Bowling Green, and the scent of wet grass and earth seeped faintly through the cracked window frame. I did not reach for my phone. I did not try to call anyone. Instead, I stared at the stack of invoices and blueprints on my desk, pretending they were the only things that mattered in the room. Years of construction projects, plans for additions to local farms, contracts for barns and workshops, all lay there untouched, as if they were waiting for a man who had not yet decided whether to move or to stay. The folder on my lap was different. It was old, worn at the edges, and smelled faintly of cedar and paper. That smell carried with it decades of family history, the weight of promises made in quiet offices, in kitchens. With sunlight streaming through curtains, where words about loyalty and protection were spoken softly but meant everything. I opened the folder again, tracing the lines of text with my eyes. The Miller Family Irrevocable Land Trust. Every clause, every signature, every date mattered. My grandfather had drafted it with a careful hand, my father had added to it, and now my name rested alongside theirs. That was the one detail Sarah had overlooked, the single barrier that rendered her plans null before they even began. I let that realization sink in while I sipped lukewarm coffee, bitter and strong, the kind that filled me with clarity more than warmth. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming against the roof and the gravel driveway. Each drop seemed to echo the steady beat of my own pulse, the slow rhythm of a man considering the next move. I thought about the farmhouse, the red barn, the fence lines, and the wide-open fields that had taught me more about patience and determination than any school ever could. Those acres were not merely property. They were a testament to years of effort, sweat, and quiet pride. Sarah might have seen numbers and signatures, but I saw memory, legacy, and duty. I began to make a mental plan, step by step, as methodically as I had managed construction projects. First, I would contact my lawyer, not in a rush, not in anger, but with careful precision. Every fact, every original copy of documents, every recorded agreement had to be ready. Then I would assemble the evidence, showing clearly how the trust functioned, how the land was protected, and how any transfer without consent was invalid. I could feel the calm settling into me, the kind of calm that precedes action, the quiet before a well-measured storm. There would be no shouting, no dramatic confrontations, only facts, documents, and logic presented with confidence. The kind of confidence a man feels when he knows the law is on his side, when he knows he has done everything by the book, and when he understands that every inch of land, every clause, every signature tells a story that cannot be ignored. I thought about Sarah, about her smug certainty that she could act without consequence. I wondered if she would recognize the significance of what she had missed, if she would feel the same shock I had felt when I first realized the sale had taken place. Perhaps she would be embarrassed, perhaps she would be frustrated, but none of that would matter in the end. The law, the trust, and the evidence would speak louder than any words between us. I set the folder down carefully, the edges aligned neatly, and stood up, stretching my back. The office was quiet, the rain a constant companion, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and ink. I walked to the window, looking out over the property that stretched beyond the office, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze, the gravel drive glistening under the storm. That land belonged to my family, and it always would. The rest of the day was a preparation, a rehearsal of steps to follow. I would not act hastily. I would not allow emotion to dictate timing. I would gather facts, organize evidence, and present a case that could not be denied. Every detail mattered, every measure, every signature, every precedent set by the trust. I thought about my grandfather again, standing under the oak tree near the barn, the wind in his hair, the lines of his face hardened from years of work and wisdom. I imagined him nodding, approving, knowing that I would do what was right, not only for me, but for the generations that would come after. And in that moment, the storm outside and the quiet inside became one. The rain continued its gentle pounding, the air thick with possibility and resolve, and I knew that by nightfall, the first step of this long process would be taken. It was not revenge. It was not anger. It was responsibility, the steady, careful execution of a duty that had been entrusted to me long before I even understood its weight. I returned to the desk, laid out the documents, and began writing a detailed list of actions, contacts, and deadlines. Each item brought clarity, each line a measured plan of action. By the time the afternoon sun tried to pierce the clouds, I had a roadmap, a sequence of steps that would ensure the property, the trust, and the family legacy remained intact. I felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing that preparation and understanding can triumph over carelessness and assumption. This was the first move in a long, deliberate strategy, and I was ready for every challenge it might bring. I spent the next few hours methodically organizing the documents and drafting notes on every clause that might matter. The office felt smaller with the storm continuing outside, rain streaking down the window in thin sheets that distorted the view of the pasture beyond. I lined up the original deeds, copies of the trust, letters from the county clerk, and past invoices that referenced the property in subtle ways. Each item placed on the desk like a step in a blueprint, a path I would follow carefully and deliberately. I checked the clock. 4:30 in the afternoon. The light outside was dim, gray but steady, the kind of light that does not cast shadows but makes every object clearly visible. I took a deep breath and opened the first letter from my lawyer, the ink faint and precise. Each sentence spelled out the legal position I held. I read it aloud quietly, letting the words sink into the room, into the walls, into me. It was not just a plan. It was clarity, a sequence of actions that would leave no room for assumption or error. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof with the rhythm of a metronome, matching the pace of my thoughts. I allowed myself a brief glance at the photograph of my grandfather by the barn again, imagining his steady gaze encouraging careful patience. I knew the next step would be a conversation with Sarah, but not yet. Timing was everything. Every detail mattered. The way she approached the topic, the way she spoke, the tone, the sequence. These were all variables I would observe and manage. I moved the blue folder slightly, making sure it lay open to the clause that invalidated any transfer without unanimous consent of all trustees, including my name. I ran my finger along the typed words, feeling the authority embedded in every sentence. It was precise, immovable, absolute. I thought about how Sarah had likely assumed the paperwork she signed was sufficient, that the county recording was the final step. She had underestimated the layers of protection built over generations. She had misjudged the quiet patience and thoroughness of a man raised to honor legacy. I brewed a fresh cup of coffee, black and strong, and placed it beside the stack of papers. The aroma was grounding, reinforcing the sense of focus that had settled over me. Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and I could see the faint outlines of trees and fence posts beyond the window, each one a reminder of what I was protecting. I made a checklist, line by line, of every contact, document, and verification needed. County clerk, title company, trustee contacts, lawyer confirmations. Each step carefully recorded in my handwriting, neat and unhurried. I imagined walking through the courthouse doors, presenting the folder confidently, watching the expressions shift as the weight of the documents became clear. No theatrics, no raised voices, only the quiet authority of prepared evidence. The thought brought a measure of calm. The office around me was filled with the gentle hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the wall clock, a contrast to the tension coiled within my mind, ready but controlled. I reflected briefly on Sarah, on her likely disbelief when faced with the thoroughness of the trust and the impossibility of her assumed claim. She had thought to act decisively, to move with speed and certainty, but she had not accounted for careful diligence, the legacy of those who had built and protected this land before her. The rain had almost stopped. I could hear the distant hum of traffic along the nearby highway and the occasional bird moving in the shelter of the trees. Each sound was a marker of continuity, life moving forward, the world unaware of the precise steps I was preparing to take. I sat back, closed my eyes briefly, and allowed a slow exhale. Strategy and patience were allies. Evidence was the voice that would speak louder than anger or assumption. By the time evening came, I had mapped out every move, prepared every document, and rehearsed mentally how each step would unfold. There would be no surprises, no missteps. The land, the legacy, and the law were aligned. With me, the storm outside had passed, leaving behind a quiet, clear night, and I felt the calm confidence of a man who knew that preparation, precision, and patience could overcome recklessness, misunderstanding, and overconfidence. Every paper in that blue folder was a safeguard, every signature a shield, every clause a reminder that the weight of history and responsibility could not be undone by a single moment of carelessness. I looked once more at the outlines of the property beyond the office window, the barn standing firm, the fence lines clear in the dim light, and knew that I was ready to ensure that what belonged to my family remained secure, intact, and protected. That night, I drove home through wet county roads with the blue folder locked in the passenger seat, buckled under the seat belt like it was something alive. The rain had moved east, leaving the asphalt slick and black under my headlights, and every mailbox I passed seemed to rise out of the dark like a witness. I kept both hands on the wheel, not because the road was difficult, but because I needed something steady to hold. The closer I got to the house, the more ordinary everything looked, and that was the part that bothered me most. Betrayal never announces itself with sirens. Sometimes it waits behind porch lights, trimmed hedges, and a dinner table set for two. Our house sat at the end of a quiet subdivision outside Bowling Green, brick front, two-car garage, American flag moving gently from the porch column. Sarah loved that house because it looked respectable. She had picked the shutters, the stone walkway, the brass numbers beside the front door. She liked things that photographed well, things that told people we were successful without requiring them to look too closely. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment with the engine ticking down, watching warm lights spill from the kitchen windows. I could see her silhouette moving inside, smooth and confident, crossing from the stove to the island with a glass in her hand. For a second, I remembered another version of her, younger, standing barefoot in our first apartment, laughing because the heat went out in February and we had eaten chili from paper bowls under two blankets. Back then, she would have called 48 acres a blessing. Now I suspected she called it equity. I carried the folder inside in my leatherwork bag, set it by the mudroom bench, and wiped my boots carefully on the mat. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic filled the hallway, warm enough to make the house feel innocent. Sarah looked up from the kitchen island and smiled like nothing in the world had shifted. She wore a cream sweater, gold earrings, and the expression of a woman who had practiced calm so long it had become a second language. "You made it," she said. "I thought you might stay late at the office again." Her voice was light, almost playful. I took off my jacket and hung it on the hook beside hers. I told her the weather slowed me down. That was true enough. Men learn to survive certain evenings by choosing sentences that are not lies, but are not invitations either. She poured iced tea into a glass and slid it across the island toward me. Her hand was steady. No tremor, no guilt showing through. I watched the lemon slice turn slowly in the amber liquid and wondered how many papers she had signed with that same steady hand. Dinner was quiet in the way staged homes are quiet, polished but unlivable. The plates were white, the napkins folded, the candles burning low even though it was just a Tuesday. Sarah talked about a charity luncheon, a contractor she disliked, a neighbor who had put up a privacy fence without matching the subdivision style. I nodded where a husband should nod. I cut my chicken, passed the salt, asked one harmless question about her day. All the while, the blue folder sat in the mudroom 20 feet away, carrying more truth than anything being said at that table. Then she cleared her throat and looked at me over the rim of her glass. "I spoke with a financial advisor today," she said, like she was mentioning a dentist appointment. "He thinks we should consider reducing some of our illiquid assets." The word illiquid hung in the air between us like smoke. I set my fork down gently. Not dropped. Not slammed. Set down. I asked her what assets she meant. She gave a small shrug, the kind people use when they want something to sound reasonable before it becomes offensive. Land mostly. And used property. Emotional holdings. Things that cost more to maintain than they give back. I looked at her then, really looked at her. The candlelight softened her face, but not her eyes. Those were sharp, measuring, already 3 steps ahead in a conversation she believed she controlled. I asked which land. She smiled, a little too quickly. Jack, do we really need to pretend? Clay Ridge has been sitting there for years. You visit it, you mow it, you fix fences no one sees. But we have a future to think about. Investments. Liquidity. Freedom. She said freedom like the land had been a chain around her ankle instead of the place my grandfather had built with blistered hands and borrowed tools. I felt something cold move through my chest. Not anger exactly, something cleaner than that. Recognition. I finally understood that she had not made one bad decision. She had built an argument inside herself long before she ever signed her name. In that argument, my family history had become dead weight, and she had made herself the practical one for cutting it loose. I asked her if she had already taken steps. Her smile changed then. Small, careful. She reached for her glass, buying half a second. We are married, she said. These decisions affect both of us. I said her name once, softly. Sarah. The room went still. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to lower itself. She looked away toward the window, where her reflection floated faintly over the dark backyard. Then she said, I did what needed to be done. There it was. Not an apology. Not a confession. A verdict. I leaned back in my chair and let the sentence settle. I could have opened the work bag right then. I could have placed the trust on the table beside the roasted chicken and watched her confidence drain away before dessert. But timing matters. A good foundation is poured only after the ground is ready. So I picked up my glass, took one slow sip of iced tea, and said, then tomorrow we should talk to the people who helped you do it. Her eyes flicked back to me, searching my face for panic, fear, outrage, anything she could use. I gave her none of it. Just calm. Just the quiet weight of a man who had already checked the posts and found the fence still standing. The next morning came pale and cold, with a thin mist hanging over the lawns and the neighborhood sprinklers ticking like little clocks along the sidewalks. I woke before sunrise, though I could not honestly say I had slept. Sarah was still upstairs when I made coffee, moving around the bedroom with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed the hardest part was already behind her. I stood at the kitchen counter in my work shirt, watching the first light gather behind the maple trees, and felt the strange calm of a man walking toward a fire with water already in his hands. The blue folder was in my truck by then, tucked beneath the passenger seat, and 3 fresh copies of the trust sat in a sealed envelope beside it. Before leaving the house, I poured coffee into my travel mug, rinsed my cup, and wiped the counter clean. Ordinary rituals matter when life turns sharp. They remind you that you still control your hands. Sarah came downstairs at 7:15, dressed in a charcoal blazer and white blouse, her hair pinned neatly, her phone already in her hand. She looked less like a wife heading into a difficult conversation and more like a person arriving prepared for a closing. That was when I understood the shape of her confidence. She did not think this was a marriage problem. She thought it was a transaction. She asked if I was ready. I said I was. Nothing more. We drove separately to the title company because she said she had meetings afterward, and I did not object. Her black Lexus backed out of the driveway first, smooth and silent, and I followed in my old Ford, the engine rumbling under me like a reminder of who I had been before polished kitchens and polite betrayals. The title office sat in a brick building near downtown Bowling Green, between a bank and a dentist, the kind of place with potted plants, framed certificates, and a reception desk where everyone spoke softly because money and property were being moved in rooms behind closed doors. Sarah was already inside when I arrived, seated beside a man I recognized from local business lunches. His name was Mark Ellison, a real estate broker with expensive shoes and a smile that never reached his eyes. Beside him sat a younger woman with a laptop and a stack of papers clipped in perfect order. Sarah glanced up at me as I walked in, and for the first time since dinner, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. Not fear. Not yet. Just a brief calculation. Jack, Mark said, standing too quickly, hand extended. Glad you could join us. I shook his hand once and sat across from them. His palm was warm and soft, his grip practiced. The conference room smelled like printer ink and lemon furniture polish. Through the window, I could see traffic moving along the street, people heading to work, carrying breakfast bags and coffee cups, unaware that inside this room, 48 acres and 3 generations of history had been reduced to line items on a settlement sheet. Mark started talking before anyone asked him to. He said the offer was strong, the buyer was eager, and the market for rural development outside the city was changing fast. He mentioned subdivisions, access roads, drainage plans, and appreciation potential. He used words that made the land sound empty, underutilized, transferable, prime. I listened without interrupting. Sarah watched me closely, waiting for the moment my emotions would make me smaller. I gave her nothing. Then Mark slid a document across the table and tapped the signature page with one manicured finger. Sarah has already authorized the sale as spouse and representative interest holder, he said. We simply need to clean up your side of things so the buyer can proceed without delay. Clean up. That was the phrase he chose for my grandfather's land. I looked down at the paper. Sarah's signature sat near the bottom in blue ink, bold and certain. Beneath it was a notary stamp, a date, and a line describing her as authorized marital party. The error was so plain that for a second I almost felt sorry for everyone in that room except her. Almost. I asked Mark, who verified ownership structure before recording. His smile tightened. The deed history was reviewed. Your wife provided supporting documentation. I turned to Sarah. She sat straighter, chin lifted. Jack, she said, we both know you have been emotional about that property for years. Someone had to think practically. There it was again. Practical. The word people use when they want selfishness to wear clean clothes. I nodded slowly and reached for my work bag. Sarah's eyes dropped to it. Mark stopped tapping his pen. The younger woman's fingers paused above her keyboard. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I simply removed the sealed envelope, opened it, and placed one copy of the trust in the center of the table. The paper made a soft sound against the polished wood, barely louder than a breath, but the whole room seemed to hear it. Mark looked down first. His expression did not change immediately. Professionals learn to hide surprise until the words on a page force it through. He read the first paragraph, then the second, then turned the page a little too quickly. The younger woman leaned closer. Sarah stared at the document as if it had appeared from beneath the floor. I pointed to the clause with my index finger. The land is held in an irrevocable family trust, I said. No individual spouse can transfer, sell, pledge, or authorize sale without written consent from all named trustees. My father's name is there. Mine is there. Sarah is not there. The room went so still I could hear the building's heating system click on. Mark swallowed once. Sarah's face changed by inches, confidence draining not all at once, but slowly, like water leaving a cracked glass. I sat back and let the document do what I had prepared it to do. Speak. Sarah shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly on the table, a rhythm that betrayed a hint of unease, though her posture remained rigid and composed. I watched without interrupting, letting the silence fill the room between words and documents. The trust lay open in front of her, every clause precise, irrefutable, and deliberately clear. I saw her lips move slightly, forming questions she did not dare to voice. Mark Ellison adjusted his tie, leaning back in his chair, and even he seemed momentarily unsettled by the authority that the document carried. I took a sip of my coffee, lukewarm now, letting the taste anchor me to calm precision. Outside the conference room windows, the morning light shifted as clouds broke, casting long diagonal beams across the polished wood of the table and reflecting faintly on the glass walls. Every beam seemed to highlight the meticulous organization of the evidence, the careful preparation that had brought us to this exact moment. I began to walk them through the clauses slowly, each paragraph a step, each signature a safeguard. I spoke in a measured tone, not loud, not accusing, simply presenting fact upon fact. Sarah's hands unclenched slightly, and I could see her calculating the weight of what she had overlooked, the irreversible nature of her assumptions. The younger woman at the laptop began typing, notes precise, careful, capturing each word as if they might hold the key to a challenge that would not exist. I made sure each point was anchored to a date, a signature, a precedent established by prior trustees. My voice was calm, deliberate, conveying authority without needing to raise it, the kind of tone that carries confidence born from certainty rather than emotion. Mark shifted in his seat, eyes flicking between Sarah and me, understanding finally that this was not a negotiation but a presentation of immovable fact. He asked one question about market valuation and I answered briefly, without allowing distraction to enter the room. I could see Sarah internalizing every word, the pride in her planning giving way to a realization that she had miscalculated not out of malice, but because she underestimated diligence and the depth of family oversight. I let a pause settle, long enough for the weight of the information to sink in fully. The room felt heavier, though no one moved. Even the clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. The air smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, ordinary and yet carrying the gravity of history, of legacy, of responsibility. I outlined the next steps carefully, indicating the trustee contacts, county notifications, and the formal steps required to validate the enforceability of the trust. Each step was procedural, deliberate, and designed to prevent misinterpretation or challenge. Sarah nodded once, slowly, almost imperceptibly, and I did not comment. Mark said nothing for a moment, then simply acknowledged receipt of the documentation, his professional demeanor returning, though more subdued than before. I gathered the extra copies of the trust, sealing them back in the envelope, and set the folder aside on the conference room credenza. I took a final glance around the room, noting the expressions, the subtle shifts in posture, the realization that authority rested on preparation, not threat or anger. Sarah looked at me, eyes tracing my calm, measured presence, the way a man carries the weight of history without letting it fracture his composure. Outside, the clouds broke further, sunlight catching on the rooftops of nearby buildings, glinting off car windshields, reflecting off puddles in the parking lot. It was ordinary, steady, unremarkable, and yet inside this ordinary space, layers of calculation, planning, and legacy had shifted the trajectory of claims, assumptions, and expectations. I collected my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and gave a small nod to Sarah, a nod that carried no malice, no triumph, only acknowledgement of what had been revealed and what was now settled. Every action had been controlled, deliberate, measured. I left the room, the door closing softly behind me, knowing that the land, the trust, and the legacy it represented were intact, protected not by anger or confrontation, but by careful, methodical attention to detail, by adherence to the rules laid down by those who had built it long before any single decision could threaten it. The parking lot outside the title office smelled like wet asphalt and exhaust, and for a few seconds I just stood beside my truck with my hand on the door handle, letting the cool Kentucky air settle against my face. The meeting had ended quietly, but quiet endings can be louder than shouting when the truth has done all the talking. Through the glass front of the building, I saw Sarah remain seated in the conference room while Mark Ellison spoke to her with both hands open on the table, the universal posture of a man explaining bad news to someone who paid him to deliver good news. She did not look at him. She looked down at the trust, or maybe through it, as if staring hard enough could change the words. I did not feel satisfaction, not the kind people imagine. No clean burst of joy, no rush of victory, no urge to smile at her collapse. What I felt was weight. The same weight I felt the first time my father handed me the keys to the old farmhouse and said, "This place will teach you what kind of man you are." Back then, I thought he meant whether I could fix fences, clear brush, and keep the barn roof from sagging another year. I understood now he meant whether I could protect something without letting bitterness turn me into someone unrecognizable. I got into the Ford, placed the work bag on the passenger seat, and called my attorney, Thomas Caldwell. He answered on the second ring, voice steady, papers rustling behind him. I told him the title office had received the trust. I told him Mark had reviewed it. I told him Sarah had been present. Thomas did not celebrate. Good lawyers rarely do. He simply said, "Then we move today." He instructed me to drive straight to his office with the original documents, the county notice, and any communication from the buyer or broker. My hand tightened once on the steering wheel. The buyer, I said, had not been in the room. Thomas went quiet for half a beat, the kind of silence that sharpens rather than softens. "Then we notify them before they claim reliance," he said. "Paper beats memory, Jack. Dates beat stories." I drove through downtown Bowling Green with that sentence sitting beside me like another passenger. Paper beats memory. Dates beat stories. It sounded cold, but there was mercy in it. Memory bends when people are scared. Stories change when money is at stake. Paper sits still. Thomas's office was on the second floor of an old building near the courthouse square, above a tax preparer and a shop that sold monogrammed baby blankets. The hallway smelled like old carpet and coffee. His receptionist, Linda, looked up when I walked in and gave me the kind of nod people give when they know a storm has arrived but do not plan to gossip about the weather. Thomas met me at the conference table with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a yellow legal pad already waiting. He was in his late 50s, silver hair, narrow glasses, calm eyes that made people tell the truth even when they had come in planning not to. I spread the documents across the table. He read them in order, not quickly, not theatrically. Each page turned with care. Every so often he made a small mark on his pad. County recording. Trust clause. Trustee consent requirement. No authority granted to spouse. Potential misrepresentation. I watched the words appear in his handwriting, neat as fence lines. When he reached Sarah's authorization page, he stopped longer. His mouth tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. This is the weak beam, he said. She presented herself as having authority she did not possess. I asked him what that meant. He leaned back, folding his glasses in one hand. It means the sale can be challenged, the recording can be flagged, and any closing based on this authorization should stop immediately. It also means we need to be precise, because if you make this emotional, they will try to frame it as marital conflict. If we make it documentary, they have to deal with the trust. There it was again, the rule of the day. Not feelings. Framework. Not outrage. Evidence. He dictated a notice letter while Linda typed in the next room, his voice even. Each phrase sharpened until it could not be misunderstood. To the title company. To the buyer's counsel. To the county clerk. To Mark Ellison. Notice of defective authority. Demand to suspend transfer. Preservation of records. Verification of trustee consent. The words stacked up like stones in a wall. By the time Linda brought in the printed copies, the room had changed. Not physically. The same table, the same blinds, the same courthouse bells chiming faintly from across the square. But I felt the ground under my boots steady itself. The law had a language, and for the first time since that phone call from the clerk, someone fluent was speaking it for my family. Thomas slid a pen toward me and pointed to the acknowledgement forms. Sign here, here, and here. I did. My signature looked familiar, but heavier, as though my hand understood before my heart did that this was not only about land anymore. This was about the first official line drawn between the life Sarah thought she could rearrange and the one my family had built to survive rearrangement. As we sealed the envelopes, my phone lit up on the table. Sarah, not a call, a message. We need to talk before this gets worse. I looked at the screen, then at Thomas. He shook his head once. No direct conversation about the property, he said. Everything through counsel now. I turned the phone face down. The movement was small, almost nothing. But inside me, something shifted for good. For 13 years, I had answered every urgent message, every cold silence, every carefully worded demand like a husband trying to keep peace. That version of me had walked out of the title office and stayed there. The man sitting in Thomas Caldwell's office was not trying to be understood anymore. He was documenting the truth. By late afternoon, the first notices had gone out by certified mail and electronic delivery, each one carrying Thomas Caldwell's letterhead and the kind of language that makes confident people suddenly reread their own paperwork. I watched Linda place the envelopes in a neat stack near the reception desk, green certified slips attached, tracking numbers printed and clipped to the file. There was something deeply American about it, almost old-fashioned, the idea that a few sheets of paper, properly worded and properly delivered, could stop bulldozers, bankers, brokers, and bad assumptions in their tracks. Thomas handed me copies in a brown envelope and told me to go home, eat something, and avoid arguments. He said it the way a doctor tells a patient not to lift anything heavy, knowing full well pride might try anyway. I drove out to Clay Ridge instead. I did not plan it. My truck just seemed to know the route, past the courthouse square, past the gas station where my father used to buy coffee before sunrise, past the feed store with faded signs in the window, then out where the road narrowed and the houses gave way to fields. The sun was dropping low behind the hills, turning the pasture gold at the edges. The gravel drive crunched beneath my tires as I pulled through the gate. For a moment, I stayed in the cab with the engine off, listening to the ticking metal cool down and the wind move through the tall grass. The old red barn stood where it always had, one side weathered silver, the roof patched in 3 different colors because my father never cared how repairs looked as long as they held. The farmhouse windows reflected the sky. The big oak near the south pond leaned over the ground like it was keeping watch. I stepped out, and the air smelled of damp soil, cedar, and cut hay. Nothing about that place knew it had almost been sold on paper. That was the strange thing. Land does not panic. Land does not argue. It simply waits to see whether the people trusted with it have enough backbone to stand where they are supposed to stand. I walked the fence line for nearly a quarter mile, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground, my hand brushing the top wire as I went. Each post reminded me of a day, a season, a lesson. My father teaching me how to set a corner brace. My grandfather telling me never to trust a gate you have not checked yourself. Sarah sitting on the tailgate 12 years ago, laughing because she had worn white sneakers to a muddy field and ruined them before lunch. That memory hit differently now. Not because it was false. It had been real. That was the hardest part. People like to believe betrayal erases the past, turns every good moment into a lie. It does not. It leaves the good moments standing, then forces you to look at what came after. I stood by the pond until the light thinned and my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I already knew who it was before I looked. Sarah again. This time the message was longer. Jack, you are making this bigger than it has to be. I was trying to help us. You never listen when money is involved. Mark says this can still be handled if you stop acting like I am the enemy. I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to understand the shape of it. No apology. No ownership. Just repositioning. She had moved from confidence to concern. From concern to accusation. And now she was trying to hand me responsibility for the mess she had created. That old pull rose in me for a second, the husband's instinct to explain, to defend, to keep the conversation from becoming a canyon. I put the phone back in my pocket without answering. Everything through counsel now. Thomas's words sat there like a locked gate. On the drive home, dusk settled over the road, and the fields on either side faded into dark shapes under a purple sky. By the time I pulled into the subdivision, Sarah's Lexus was in the garage, and every downstairs light in the house was on. She was waiting in the kitchen when I came in, standing beside the island with her arms folded and her phone on the counter. The house smelled like nothing this time. No roasted chicken, no garlic, no staged warmth. Just cold air and furniture polish. She asked where I had been. I set my keys in the bowl by the door and said Clay Ridge. Her jaw tightened. Of course, she said. The shrine. I looked at her, and something in her face made me finally see the full distance between us. She did not hate the land because it cost us money. She hated it because it was a part of me she had never managed to own. I told her any discussion about the property had to go through Thomas Caldwell. Her eyes sharpened. So now you are lawyering up against your own wife. I did not answer the bait. I walked to the sink, filled a glass of water, and took one slow drink. She followed me with words, each one more polished than the last. She said I was being emotional. She said my family had trapped money in dead land. She said the buyer was offering more than the property would ever be worth again. Then came the sentence that showed me where her heart had been standing all along. She said, "Your grandfather is gone, Jack. He does not get a vote anymore." I set the glass down carefully. The room went quiet around that sentence. I thought about the trust in Thomas's office, the signatures, the claws, the careful hands of men who had known storms would come after them. I looked at Sarah and spoke softly, because some truths do not need volume. He already voted. That is what the document is. Her face changed then, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. For the first time, she understood that the past she had dismissed was not sentimental decoration. It was legally alive, standing in the room with us, stronger than her signature, stronger than Mark's promises, stronger than every excuse she had prepared. The following morning arrived clear and crisp, with sunlight slicing through the blinds and warming the kitchen floor in golden streaks. I made coffee as usual, the smell strong and grounding, and looked out the window toward the subdivision street where the mail carrier had already passed. The blue folder and envelope of trust documents were on the counter, neat and waiting for the next step, a silent reminder that preparation matters more than impulse. I heard Sarah moving upstairs, the faint click of heels on the wooden steps, and I did not flinch. There was no need. The documents had already done their work, presenting clarity where confusion and assumption had once ruled. I sipped my coffee, feeling the warmth spread slowly, matching the steadiness that had settled in my chest since yesterday. I reviewed the sequence of actions again in my mind. Notices sent, county clerk and title company informed, buyer notified, trustee consents verified. Each step aligned, precise and deliberate. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Thomas Caldwell. His voice was calm, a measure of authority that had never been louder than in the quiet of a room where decisions were final. He instructed me to attend a brief meeting with the trustee board to reaffirm the trust's directives, ensuring that every record was officially acknowledged. I nodded, even though he could not see me. The drive to the trustee office took 20 minutes through familiar roads lined with oak and maple trees, their leaves turning shades of amber and crimson with the approach of autumn. I parked my Ford, walked to the building, and entered a space that smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Inside, the trustees were already seated, their expressions welcoming yet alert. I laid out the documents, including the certified notices, and walked them through every detail. The irrevocable nature of the trust, the names of all trustees, the authority required for any transfer, and the lack of such authority from any single spouse. Each point was reinforced by signatures and dates, every one verified. The trustees nodded, recording notes on their pads, confirming that every measure had been taken to ensure compliance. Sarah had been informed indirectly through counsel, and I did not speak to her. Her role in the matter was now procedural. Her assumption of authority had been countered by careful legal structure. The meeting concluded, and I left with copies of acknowledgments, feeling the satisfaction of a well-executed plan rather than the thrill of victory. The drive home was calm, the fields stretching wide on either side, dew glistening on grass, the sky pale and clear. I arrived at the house, stepped onto the porch, and breathed in the crisp air. Inside, everything was quiet, orderly, normal. I placed the envelopes back in their spot on the counter and took a moment to sit by the window, looking toward Clay Ridge, where the red barn and white farmhouse stood strong in memory and fact. Sarah had been absent from the property itself during this entire process, and that distance reinforced what had been achieved. The land, the trust, and the legal recognition of authority were secure. I could finally feel the weight of anticipation lift, replaced by the calm certainty that comes from aligning preparation, law, and legacy. Afternoon sunlight shifted through the window, casting long shadows across the kitchen tiles, and I traced them with my eyes like lines of a blueprint, measuring steadiness, order, and control. Each document, each signature, each verification had acted as intended, creating a barrier to misunderstanding, assumption, or manipulation. I poured a second cup of coffee, black and strong, and sat quietly, reflecting on the care required to maintain both land and legacy. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with ordinary life. Mailboxes clinking, neighbors walking dogs, children riding bicycles. The world continued, oblivious to the careful work that had preserved the history of a family and the value of land that had survived generations. I allowed myself a small, deep exhale. This was not about revenge. It was about responsibility, about ensuring that what had been built through decades of effort and trust remained intact. I looked at the sunlit kitchen, the envelopes stacked neatly, the shadows stretching across the floor, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had navigated complexity with patience, clarity, and preparation. Everything that mattered was still here, exactly where it should be, and nothing, no assumption or misstep, could change that.